I'm going to talk about the firs, or true fir genus, which is Abies. A-B-I-E-S is the scientific name, Abies. It's in the pine family. It has needle-like leaves, so this is an example of a true fir. Needle-like leaves, spiral arrangement. Each needle is held individually on the twig. They tend to be aromatic and have a blunt apex. Not always, but often. Should have done this before. But if you look close, they do leave a round, flat leaf scar. Can you see it at all?
Yes.
So at the bottom of a fir needle, the base of the needle sort of flares out almost like a little suction cup, a round end, and it suction cups right onto the twig. And when you pull off the needles, it leaves a round, flat leaf scar. And once you recognize that, and you start, pulling off needles and looking for that leaf scar, you can recognize firs anywhere because of the leaf scar is so perfectly round. And compared to a lot of leaf scars, which tend to be upraised, this one is not. Okay. Another characteristic is that firs tend to have 3 buds at the terminal end of the twig. And as a result, they tend to all break as the tree grows. So you end up with this repeating pattern of 3s. So it'll branch into 3, and then 3 will set here, and then 3 again. And you end up with something that looks very predictable and sort of geometric in its shape, modular almost. Very predictable pattern, which is why firs are so beautiful and why people like using them for things like Christmas trees and things like that. The needles themselves can have bloom on them, either on the top or the bottom, or both. Looking at the cones, they are cylindrical in shape, sort of barrel-shaped, really.
There we go.
They have spiral arrangement of scales, and the scales have smooth margins. They're held upright on the branch, almost like a little bird perched up there, like so, and they tend to be way at the top of the tree, so hard to see. When they are mature, they fall apart, and the scales are dropped with the seeds. So the whole thing becomes a big mess on the ground. And I did bring over, here it is. The only thing that's left on the tree, which I've got for this upper branch here that fell to the ground, this stick that's coming up is all that's left of that cone that fell apart. All the scales and seeds are gone. So it's a deciduous cone, which makes it not a great characteristic for identification, except for when you can see it from a distance, say with binoculars, that they're all upright and at the top of the tree is pretty good characteristic for fir. Fir trees tend to have resin blisters, smooth bark when they're young, and resin blisters. There's often a lot of resin in different species within the genus. Okay. There are actually quite a diverse number of firs in Oregon. We're going to be learning 6 different species, and they're kind of hard to tease apart, so I've got a little memory key to help you remember that.
You start handing you
Does that
stuff.
look good?
Yeah.
All right, so the way this is going to work is we're going to go through these steps one at a time. You can't start at 2 or 3. You got to start with 1, move to 2. If 2 doesn't work, we'll move to 3. First, you have to identify the tree as a fir. So you have to look for that round, flat leaf scar, the blunt needle, and spirally arranged. So all those things are going to be helpful for identifying first that it's a fir. Once you think it's a fir, and the cone characteristics also, then you got to figure out which species it is. So the first step in this memory key is green above, and I underline G and A because there's 2 different species that are green above. What I mean by green above is that there's no bloom on the upper surface of the needle, only the undersurface. So on the upper surface, it's going to look completely green, kind of grassy green.
Can you hold it against the light?
Does that make it easier?
Yes.
There's 2 different species of the 6 that have no bloom on the upper surface. The other 4 do. So that's the first thing you're going to look for. If it has no bloom on the upper surface of the needle, it has to be either Abies grandis, the G is for green here, grandis, or Abies amabilis, the A is for above, to help you remember it. Okay? So this is a grand fir. So grand fir needles are 2 ranked. What that means is they're parted in the center, almost like someone coned them to 2 sides of the twig. They do have bloom on the underside, 2 bands of bloom, but on the upper surface they're green and they spread to 2 directions. The other thing about them, which I don't know, you can probably see that right here, is they alternate long, short. So one needle will be shorter, the next one up the twig will be a little longer, and then shorter and longer all the way down. Okay. All right, so with the grand fir, that's my twig, and I've got my needles here. They're on 2 ranked, and they alternate long, short. So that's how I'm going to draw that. You can see the top of the twig because the needles are kind of parted in the center and peeled off to 2 sides. So that's grand fir. I don't have a Pacific silver fir to show you here today, but there's a separate presentation for you to watch for Pacific silver fir. But I want you to see what the needles look like. So in Pacific silver fir, it's going to be green above. There's no bloom on the upper surface. And one set of needles are going to stick straight out to the sides, like in a 2-ranked fashion, similar to grand fir. But then there's going to be another set that points forward toward the end of the twig, almost like little V's or ski jump skis, so pointing downward. So that's Abies amabilis, Pacific silver fir. Again, no bloom on the upper surface of the needle, pretty pronounced bloom on the undersurface for both species. The way to tell them apart is going to be this particular arrangement of the needles. Grand fir has the most, I gotta stand up because I can only squat for so long. The grand fir has a really wide range in the Northwest. It grows at a variety of elevations from sea level to pretty high elevations. It's found throughout the Northwest, both the Pacific Northwest and the interior Northwest, which makes it a little different than some of these other firs. It's a primary late successional species in the interior Northwest, where it replaces ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, some of the other less shade tolerant fir species. In contrast, Pacific silver fir is very much a Pacific Northwest species. It's common on the west slope of the Cascade Range in Oregon and in Washington, where there's a lot of heavy wet snow, and it's also part of the climax tree forest composition in those forests. It's very, very shade tolerant. Can live in the understory for many, many years without growing, or growing just a tiny bit, and as soon as a bigger tree falls, it'll replace it, it'll put on a spurt of growth and take that spot. So the grand fir is very widespread into the interior Northwest. The Pacific silver fir is really much more of a Pacific coast species. So here in Oregon, it's in the Cascade Range on the west side, but as you go north, there's more mountain ranges as you move into Canada that are close to the coast, and you can find Pacific silver fir moving closer to the coast as you go north. Step 2. If you have a fir and you look at the needles and there's bloom on the upper surface of the needle, meaning it could just be a tiny bit of bluish colored bloom or white right at the tip of the needle, or the whole top could have bloom on it. But if it's got anything, you've got to go to step 2. That'll rule out these first 2 species. So in step 2, this is mostly procera, or procera, however you want to pronounce it. The M here is for Abies magnifica, and the P is for the name procera. So there's 2 here, and what you're looking for in this step
Sorry.
That's okay. And so maybe if I put this down, I'm not sure what the best thing here. Can you see that? What you're looking for there is that on the underside of the needle, right where the needle attaches to the twig, it takes a little bend. It has a little hook, almost like it's a little like a hockey stick. Basically, the needle, as it comes in from at a perpendicular to the twig, but once it reaches the twig, it comes into parallel arrangement with the twig. So it takes has a little J-shaped hook to it. So on the upper surface, we saw this whitish color here, or bluish color. That's the bloom on the upper surface takes you to step 2. In step 2, you're looking to see, does it have this J-shaped hook? If it does, it's got to be one of these 2. This one here that I'm showing you is a noble fir, Abies procera, noble fir. So the characteristics, other than having bloom on the upper surface of the needle, J-shaped hook to the back side where it attaches to the twig, upswept needles and pretty dense, kind of covers the whole top of the needles or the twig so you can't see the twig. In the center of each needle there's a slight groove. You're not going to be able to see that. You need a hand lens to see that, but it's a tiny little groove. And then the cone is very distinctive actually for noble fir. It's huge, first of all. This is like 6 inches. There, 5, 6 inches. Again, it's a fir, so it's going to be held upright on the branch. But what you'll notice, these sort of papery things sticking out between the scales, those are bracts. So in noble fir, the bracts are longer than the scales. So it's a large cone and it has bracts that stick out. It's the only fir of the 6 that has bracts that are longer than the scales. Okay. And noble fir grows in both the Coast Range of Oregon and Washington at high enough elevations, usually above 4,000 feet, or at those same middle elevations in the Cascade Range on the west side. As you head down south into southern Oregon Cascades, it starts interbreeding with this other species, the California red fir, Abies magnifica. Now, Abies magnifica branches look pretty much identical to noble fir. They have bloom on the upper surface, the needles are upswept, they have the J-shaped needle here. The main differences here, the top of the needle in a California red fir, there's a slight ridge instead of a groove that runs along the midrib. Again, you have to look so close to see that. Looking at the cone, no, it's a similar size to the noble fir, but the bracts don't stick out longer than the cone scales. And I don't have a picture of it here, but another way you can tell the 2 apart is that noble fir has sort of it starts out with a very white, gray colored bark and becomes darker, grayer, grayish brown over time, while the California red fir becomes a reddish brown. It starts out white though too and becomes reddish brown and furrowed, more furrowed than noble fir. The noble fir had the range that was in Washington and Oregon Cascades, while the California red fir picks up around. You can start seeing evidence of hybridization happening right around Crater Lake. As you go further south toward Mount Shasta, you start seeing more and more populations that look more like the California red fir, and then went throughout the Sierra Nevada in the mixed conifer zone. That's at the highest elevations in the Sierra Nevada. That's where you're going to find a lot of California red fir with a wide variety of other species. Both are really popular for Christmas trees because of that beautiful bluish colored foliage, and they are easy to cultivate as well. So looking for that J-shaped hook, and then remembering that the range for noble fir is to the north and California red fir is to the south, and then the bracts, that's the way you're going to tell those 2 apart. Okay, but we're not done yet. There's more. There is this last chance. So if you look at the undersurface of the needle, so first of all, note that there's bloom on the upper surface of this needle. Can you see the bluish color on both sides? Okay, so that would take you out of the first group, green above. You flip it over, and you might notice that the needles do look a little bit curved, but they don't have a hook at the base. They're more curved along their entire length instead of just right at the end. So that's not the J-shaped look. If you have bloom above, no J-shape, you're at last chance. There's two more species that have those characteristics. No J-shape, bloom on the upper surface. That's Abies lasiocarpa, which is subalpine fir, and then white fir, which is Abies concolor. Right, so I'm holding here. Let's start with that one. I think there's that might just be another noble fir. It's this one actually. All right, so these are subalpine fir, and I kind of wanted to show you how different they can look. So subalpine fir grows where you might expect, right up at timberline, where the conditions are pretty harsh, but it also grows further down to some kind of high, middle to high elevations. The further down you go into milder temperatures, the longer their needles and more lush the tree looks. As you approach tree line, the needles get shorter and shorter and more bristly along a branch. It's all the same tree, but it looks different. But you can see that there's bloom on both sides. You flip it over and there's no J-shaped hook. These needles tend to be less than an inch in length in subalpine fir. They tend to be fairly dense and upswept, covering the twig so you can't see it. The tree itself is small and narrow and usually limbed right to the base. It doesn't get very tall. It grows in really harsh conditions, and in some places it will form crumb holes, twisted shapes and forms that are really low to the ground because of those icy winds that shear off buds. It's a harsh climate. So subalpine fir is one of the most common late successional fir species in the interior Northwest. You can find it in the Rocky Mountains, all along the Rocky Mountains, up into Canada. We have some here on the eastern slope of the Cascades and in some of the interior mountains like the Blue Mountains, where the elevation is high enough. It tends to be with Engelmann spruce, forming a climax community in those highest forests before you leave tree line and move into the alpine. Okay. The other species, the last one, Abies concolor, white fir. You see the bloom on the upper surface of the needle.
I have to. Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
And you flip it over and there's no J shape. Very similar, but here the needles tend to be long, often over an inch, so subalpine fir tends to be smaller, these tend to be longer, and you can see how they're parted in the middle. Instead of everything being upswept here in the subalpine, so it looks like a brush, here there's a distinct part. It's not as too ranked as grand fir, but it's still parted, and that's a good way to identify it. Plus, the bloom tends to be just like almost painted down the center line rather than covering it. Okay, so that is the white fir. White fir grows in the Cascade Mountains from central to southern Oregon down through the Sierra Nevada, and then also in the Rocky Mountains, but in the southern Rocky Mountains, down southern Colorado and even further south. That's where you're going to find the white fir. The white fir is the most drought tolerant of the 6. So the subalpine fir is really a tree of the high mountains of the interior Northwest, while the white fir is a tree of the mountains of the Southwest. So just knowing the ranges are different can help you, but the main thing there is looking for longer needles in the white fir and the parted nature there is, while the subalpine fir is upswept. It's a lot to practice, I know.